He was called the father of his country, the American general and commander-in-chief of the colonial armies in the American Revolution from 1775 to 1783, and subsequently the first president of the United States from 1789 to 1797. Hello and welcome to UPSC History View. Today, let's learn about George Washington. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732 in Westmoreland County, Virginia, and he died on December 14, 1799 in Mount Vernon, Virginia. Washington's father, Augustine Washington, had gone to school in England, tested seafaring life, and then settled down to manage his growing Virginia estates. Washington's mother was Mary Ball, whom Augustine, a widower, had married early the previous year. Washington's paternal lineage had some distinction. An early forebear was described as a gentleman. Henry VIII later gave the family lands, and its members held various offices. But family fortunes fell with the Puritan Revolution in England, and John Washington, grandfather of Augustine, migrated in 1657 to Virginia. The ancestral home at Sulgrave, Northamptonshire, is maintained as a Washington memorial. Little definite information exists on any of the line until Augustine. He was an energetic, ambitious man who acquired much land, built mills, took an interest in opening iron mines, and sent his two eldest sons to England for schooling. By his first wife, Jane Butler, he had 4 children. By his second wife, Mary Ball, he had 6 children. Augustine died on April 12, 1743. Let's learn about the childhood and youth of George Washington. Little is known of George Washington's early childhood, spent largely on the Ferry Farm on the Rappahannock River, opposite Fredericksburg, Virginia. Mason L. Weems' stories of the hatchet and cherry tree and of youth Washington's repugnance to fighting are apocryphal efforts to fill a manifest gap. He attended school irregularly from his 7th to his 15th year, first with the local church sexton and later with a schoolmaster named Williams. Some of his schoolboy papers survive. Washington was fairly well trained in practical mathematics, gauging, several types of mensuration, and such trigonometry as was useful in surveying. He studied geography, possibly had a little Latin, and certainly read some of the Spectator and other English classics. The copybook in which he transcribed at 14 a set of moral precepts or rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation was carefully preserved. Washington's best training, however, was given him by practical men and outdoor occupations, not by books. He mastered tobacco growing and stock raising, and early in his teens he was sufficiently familiar with surveying to plot the fields around him. At his father's death, the 11-year-old Washington became the ward of his eldest half-brother, Lawrence, a man of fine character who gave him wise and affectionate care. Lawrence inherited the beautiful estate of Little Hunting Creek, which had been granted to the original settler John Washington and which Augustine had done much since 1738 to develop. Lawrence married Anne Fairfax, daughter of Colonel William Fairfax, a cousin and agent of Lord Fairfax and one of the chief proprietors of the region. Lawrence also built a house and named the 2,500-acre holding Mount Vernon in honor of the admiral under whom he had served in the siege of Cartagena. Living there chiefly with Lawrence, George entered a more spacious and polite world. Anne Fairfax Washington was a woman of charm, grace, and culture. Lawrence had brought from his English school and naval service much knowledge and experience. A valued neighbor and relative, George William Fairfax, whose large estate, Belvoir, was about 4 miles distant, and other relatives by marriage, the Carlyles of Alexandria helped form George's mind and manners. The youth turned first to surveying as a profession. Lord Fairfax, a middle-aged bachelor who owned more than 5 million acres in northern Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley, came to America in 1746 to live with his cousin George William at Belvoir and took to look after his properties. 2 years later, he sent to the Shenandoah Valley a party to survey and plot his lands to make regular tenants of the squatters moving in from Pennsylvania. With the official surveyor of Prince William County in charge, Washington went along as assistant. The 16-year-old lad kept a disjointed diary of the trip, which shows skill in observation. He describes the discomfort of sleeping under one threadbare blanket with double its weight of vermin such as lice, fleas, and see an encounter with an Indian war party bearing a scalp, the Pennsylvania German emigrants as ignorant a set of people as the Indians. They would never speak English, but when spoken to they speak all Dutch, and the serving of roast wild turkey on a large chip, for as for dishes we had none. The following year in 1749, aided by Lord Fairfax, Washington received an appointment as official surveyor of Culpeper County, and for more than 2 years he was kept almost constantly busy. Surveying not only in Culpeper but also in Frederick and Augusta counties, Washington made journeys far beyond the Tidewater region into the western wilderness. The experience taught him resourcefulness and endurance and toughened him in both body and mind. Coupled with Lawrence's ventures inland, it also gave him an interest in western development that endured throughout his life. Washington was always disposed to speculate in Western holdings and to view favorably projects for colonizing the West, and he greatly resented the limitations that the Crown in time laid on the westward movement. In 1752, Lord Fairfax determined to take up his final residence in the Shenandoah Valley and settle there in a log hunting lodge, which he called the Greenway Court after a Kentish manor of his family's. There, Washington was sometimes entertained and had access to a small library that Fairfax had begun accumulating at Oxford. The years 1751 to 52 marked a turning point in Washington's life, for they placed him in control of Mount Vernon. Lawrence, stricken by tuberculosis, went to Barbados in 1751 for his health, taking George along. From this sole journey beyond the present borders of the United States, Washington returned with the light scars of an attack of smallpox. In July of the next year, Lawrence died, making George executor and residuary heir of his estate should his daughter Sarah die without issue. As she died within 2 months, Washington at age 20 became head of one of the best Virginia estates. He always thought farming the most delectable of pursuits. "It is honorable," he wrote, "it is amusing, and with superior judgment it is profitable." And of all the spots for farming, Washington thought Mount Vernon the best. "No estate in United America," he assured an English correspondent, "is more pleasantly situated than this." Washington's greatest pride in later days was to be regarded as the first farmer of the land. He gradually increased the estate until it exceeded 8,000 acres. He enlarged the house in 1760 and made further enlargements and improvements on the house and its landscaping in 1784 to 86. Washington also tried to keep abreast of the latest scientific advances. For the next 20 years, the main background of Washington's life was the work and society of Mount Vernon. He gave assiduous attention to the rotation of crops, fertilization of the soil, and the management of livestock. Washington had to manage the 18 slaves that came with the estate and others he bought later. By 1760, Washington had paid taxes on 49 slaves, though he strongly disapproved of the institution and hoped for some mode of abolishing slavery. At the time of his death, more than 300 slaves were housed in the quarters on Washington's property. Washington had been unwilling to sell slaves lest families be broken up, even though the increase in their numbers placed a burden on him for their upkeep and gave him a larger force of workers than he required, especially after he gave up the cultivation of tobacco. In his will, Washington bequeathed the slaves in his possession to his wife and ordered that upon her death they be set free, declaring also that the young, the aged, and the infirm among them shall be comfortably clothed and fed by my heirs. Still, this accounted for only about half the slaves on his property. The other half, owned by Washington's wife, were entailed on the Curtis estate, so that on her death they were destined to pass to her heirs. However, Washington's wife freed all the slaves in 1800 after his death. For diversion, Washington was fond of riding, fox hunting, and dancing, of such theatrical performances as he could reach, and of duck hunting and sturgeon fishing. Washington liked billiards and cards and not only subscribed to racing associations but also ran his own horses in races. In all outdoor pursuits, from wrestling to colt breaking, Washington excelled. A friend of the 1750s describes Washington as straight as an Indian, measuring 6 feet 2 inches in his stockings, as very muscular and broad-shouldered, but though large-boned, weighing only 175 pounds, and as having long arms and legs. Washington's penetrating blue-grey eyes were overhung by heavy eyebrows. His nose was large and straight, and his mouth was large and firmly closed. His movements and gestures are graceful, his walk majestic, and he is a splendid horseman. Washington soon became prominent in community affairs and was an active member and later vestryman of the Episcopal Church, and as early as 1755 he expressed a desire to stand for the Virginia House of Burgesses. Thank you for listening to the childhood and youth of George Washington. For more such discussions, get the UPSC Practice app from the App Store and visit upscpractice.com.